What if the first human home was not a nation, not a tribe, and not a border, but a place many of us now imagine as distant? The cold truth is that before cities, flags, languages, and the idea of race, Homo sapiens began in Africa, not as rulers of Earth, but as small, fragile groups under a changing sky. If Africa was our first home, why did the human story have to leave it? Before Africa became our first human home, it was not an empty stage waiting for people to arrive. It was already ancient, already alive, already changing in ways no single creature could control. Long before anyone could name a river, remember a border, or tell a child where a people began, the land held forests, open grasslands, lakes, wetlands, stone hills, dry valleys, and coastlines that shifted with time. Africa was not one simple place. It was many places folded into one continent, and this matters because the origin of human life did not rise from a single background. It rose from variety. It rose from heat and shade, from wet seasons and dry seasons, from places where food could be found for a while and then disappear, from landscapes that asked every living thing to adjust or fade. When we ask whether Africa was our first home, we are not only asking where Homo sapiens appeared, we are asking what kind of world could slowly shape a creature fragile enough to die easily, but flexible enough to keep learning. The answer begins before modern humans, in a continent that did not protect life by making it easy. It protected life by making change constant. A lake might shrink, a river might move, a patch of green might return after rain, then turn pale under a long dry sky. Animals followed water, plants followed seasons, predators followed movement. Early human ancestors were part of this living pattern, not above it. They were not born into comfort. They were born into attention. To survive in such a world, a body had to notice, a group had to remember, a mother had to know where shade might be found. An older member might recognize the smell of a place after rain. A child might learn which sound meant danger and which silence meant nothing at all. This is why the first home of human life should not be imagined as a peaceful garden or a single warm valley where everything was given. It was more like a patient teacher. It did not speak, but it repeated lessons. It showed that water mattered. It showed that timing mattered. It showed that no place stayed the same forever. In this slow pressure, the deep background of humanity began to form. Africa gave early humans not just a place to stand, but a world that required awareness. Still, it would be a mistake to picture this story as one straight road leading neatly to us. Human origins were not a clean line drawn across a map. The fossil and genetic story points strongly to Africa as the birthplace of Homo sapiens, but within Africa, the story was broad and uneven. Different groups lived in different regions, under different skies, near different animals, stones, plants, and waters. Some places may have been connected for a time, then separated by distance, drought, or changing habitat. Life did not move like a line in a textbook. It moved like breath, expanding, narrowing, pausing, returning. That is what makes Africa so important to the quiet origin of human life. It was large enough to hold many experiments in survival at once. In one region, early people could learn the patience of watching animals cross open ground. In another, they could learn the hidden knowledge of plants, roots, and seasonal fruit. Near water, they could learn the rhythm of fish, birds, shells, mud, and reeds. On stony ground, they could learn how rock breaks, how an edge cuts, how a hand can turn a hard object into a useful one. None of these lessons made humans suddenly modern. None of them created a finished mind overnight. But together, across long spans of time, they formed the conditions in which a new kind of human life could slowly appear. So when we say Africa was our first home, we should not imagine only a point on the map. We should imagine a changing continent that trained memory, movement, cooperation, and attention before anyone knew those things would become human strengths. The first home was not a house. It was not a homeland in the modern sense. It was a living world, wide and unstable, where the earliest shape of us was quietly being tested. The first human home should not be imagined as a place where humans already stood above the rest of life. In the beginning of our story, there was no throne waiting for us. There was no promise that our kind would last. The early human line survived in Africa not because it was the strongest animal on the land, but because it belonged to a world where weakness had to become awareness. A human body was not built like the body of a great cat. It did not have the speed of antelope, the weight of elephant, the armored skin of rhinoceros, or the teeth of a large predator. Even after walking upright became one of the deep signs of the human path, standing tall did not mean being safe. It may have helped with seeing over grass, carrying food, moving through different ground, and using the hands more freely, but it did not remove hunger, thirst, injury, or fear. Africa, as the first home of the human story, was not a shelter from danger. It was the place where danger taught carefulness. To live there, early humans and their ancestors had to notice what other animals noticed, and then remember it together. They had to learn where shade could be found when the sun became heavy. They had to learn where water might remain when the land dried. They had to learn which open spaces left them exposed, which trees offered cover, which stones could be useful, and which sounds in the distance meant that another creature had seen something first. This was not the life of rulers. It was the life of small groups, moving through a continent that was alive before them and larger than them. The word home can sound soft, but the first home of humanity was not soft in the modern sense. It held comfort only in brief moments: a cooler evening, a shared resting place, a patch of food, the return of rain, the presence of familiar faces. These small moments mattered because survival was never only about the individual. A lone human was vulnerable. A group could watch in more than one direction. A group could carry knowledge in more than one body. A group could protect children, remember paths, share food, and notice change before it became disaster. In this way, Africa did not simply contain early humans. It shaped the habits that would later feel deeply human: attention, cooperation, caution, learning, and care. None of these traits appeared suddenly as a grand invention. They were built slowly, under pressure, through ordinary needs repeated for thousands of generations. A child who survived learned not only from pain, but from watching older bodies move through the land. An adult who remembered a dry season could become valuable when the same kind of season returned. A mother carrying an infant needed the group, and the group needed the next generation. An older person who no longer moved as quickly might still hold memory that mattered. In a harsh landscape, memory itself could become a form of shelter. This is why the origin of Homo sapiens in Africa should not be reduced to a date, even though the date matters. Around 300,000 years ago, during a time of major environmental change, Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, and like other early humans, they hunted, gathered, and developed behaviors that helped them survive unstable conditions. But the deeper meaning is quieter than the number. Before people spread widely across the world, before they looked different in different climates, before they built villages or named themselves by nations, they belonged to small African worlds where being human meant being unfinished. Their bodies were still part of nature's risk. Their minds were still learning what kind of creature they could become. If Africa was our first home, then it was also the first place where human fragility was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a slower answer: how a vulnerable animal, living among stronger animals, could survive by becoming more watchful, more social, and more dependent on remembered experience. And that makes the first home of human life feel less like a birthplace on a map and more like a long lesson in humility. To call Africa our first home is not the same as calling it our first country. That difference matters. A country has borders, flags, laws, and names that people agree to remember. The first human home had none of those things. It had no line drawn across the ground, telling one group where belonging ended and another began. It had no single language that could explain itself to the future. It had no written memory, no maps, no monuments, and no idea of a race the way later humans would come to imagine it. It was older than all of those divisions. When Homo sapiens began in Africa, they began as living bodies inside landscapes, not as members of modern categories. They knew water, hunger, heat, cold nights, animal paths, familiar faces, safe resting places, and the slow return of seasons. They did not know the labels that would one day separate human beings from one another. This is why the question, "Was Africa our first home?" must be handled gently. It is not saying that one modern group owns the human beginning more than another. It is saying something almost opposite. The beginning is older than ownership. It belongs to the shared story of our species, before the world divided people into nations, colors, continents, and histories. In that deeper sense, Africa was not a border around one people. It was the living ground from which all modern human lineages would eventually connect. The people who lived there hundreds of thousands of years ago were not African in the modern political meaning of the word. They were early Homo sapiens and related human populations living across a vast and changing continent. Their world did not fit inside the names we use now. A valley, a river basin, a lakeshore, a dry plain, a rocky shelter, or a green corridor after rain may have mattered more to them than any large identity. Home was not an abstract idea. Home was the place where the group could find water again. Home was where children recognized the voices of those who protected them. Home was where older memories still worked. Home was the known path through an uncertain land. If there is a quiet truth here, it is that human origin begins before human separation. Long before a person could be called European, Asian, American, or anything else, the body of Homo sapiens carried an African beginning. Later, as some groups moved out of Africa and settled in other environments, human appearance would slowly change. Skin color, body proportions, hair texture, and other traits would respond over long periods to sunlight, climate, food, isolation, and migration. But these later differences did not erase the older unity. They were variations inside one species, not signs of separate human worth. The first home of human life asks us to look beneath the surface of difference and see time. A lighter skin in one region and darker skin in another are not two beginnings. They are later adaptations on a much older human body. The origin remains deeper than appearance. This matters for the story of Africa because the continent was not just a place people left. It was the place where the basic human condition had already been shaped. The need to learn, to belong, to care, to remember, to move, to adapt, and to live with uncertainty. When groups eventually traveled beyond Africa, they did not carry nothing with them. They carried bodies shaped by African environments. They carried social habits learned in small groups. They carried attention to water, weather, animals, tools, children, and danger. They carried the quiet inheritance of a first home that had trained them long before they knew they were leaving it. So the phrase, "our first home," should not make the story narrower. It should make it wider. It should remind us that the earliest human beginning is not the property of a modern border. It is not proof that one kind of person is closer to humanity than another. It is a reminder that before humans spread across Earth and began to look different, we were already connected by a past that had no passport, no flag, and no race. Africa, in this sense, is not only a location in the story, it is the oldest shared room in the memory of Homo sapiens. Long before Homo sapiens appeared in Africa, something quieter had already begun. A body in the human line had started to rise. Not all at once, not perfectly, and not in the proud way we might imagine when we look at ourselves today, but slowly, unevenly, through bones, balance, feet, hips, and habit. Walking on two legs was not the final step that made us human. It was one of the older openings in the human story, a change that came millions of years before the people we would recognize as modern humans. This is important because the first home of Homo sapiens was built on a much deeper past. Africa did not suddenly produce a finished human being around 300,000 years ago. It held a long history of earlier human relatives, each carrying part of the path, each living in a world where standing upright could be useful without making life easy. The evidence from East Africa reminds us of this slow beginning. Australopithecus afarensis, the species often connected with the famous skeleton called Lucy, lived between about 3.85 and 2.95 million years ago. These were not modern humans. Their brains were much smaller than ours. Their bodies still carried signs of a life that could include climbing as well as walking, yet they belonged to a line in which upright movement was already real. The Laetoli footprints in Tanzania, made about 3.6 million years ago, preserve a direct trace of early hominins walking on 2 feet across ancient ground. They are not words, tools, or monuments. They are marks pressed into volcanic ash, quiet impressions of bodies passing through a landscape that did not know it was recording the future. For a sleep listener, this image matters. Before human memory could speak, the ground remembered a walk. Still, we should not turn this into a simple picture of apes becoming people in one clean moment. Evolution did not work like a ladder, with one creature stepping neatly into the next. Chimpanzees did not turn into humans. Humans and chimpanzees share a distant common ancestor, and after that ancient split, different branches followed different paths. The path that led toward us was long, branching, and uncertain. Some relatives disappeared. Some left only fragments. Some lived beside other related forms. Walking upright was part of this larger experiment, not a guarantee of success. In Africa, an upright body could see differently, move differently, carry differently, and use the hands in new ways. But it still had to face thirst, predators, injury, competition, and changing habitats. Standing higher did not place early hominins above nature. It placed them differently inside it. A creature walking on 2 legs could look over grass for a moment, but it could also be seen. It could carry food or an infant, but carrying meant effort. It could travel across mixed ground, but travel brought risk. This is the quiet truth behind the first human home. Africa shaped the human line not by granting power, but by testing usefulness. A new way of moving had to matter in real places, under real weather, among real animals, and real shortages. The ancient African landscape was not only background, it was the condition under which bodies were judged by survival. Over countless generations, small differences in movement, balance, endurance, attention, and group life could matter. A foot that met the ground in a different way, a pelvis that carried weight more efficiently, a hand that was free more often, a group that learned to move together through open and wooded spaces. None of these things made Homo sapiens immediately, but they prepared the older road. When we later ask why Africa was our first home, we must remember that Homo sapiens inherited a body already shaped by millions of years of African living. The modern human did not begin from nothing. Before our species had its name, before our face became our face, before our mind carried stories, the human line had already learned one of its first deep lessons. To rise from the ground was not to escape the earth, it was to meet the earth in a new way. When the human line began to walk more often on 2 legs, the hands did not become magical. They did not suddenly know how to make tools, shape stone, carry fire, or build the future. But they became available in a new way. That small word, available, is important. A hand that is not always needed for moving across the ground can begin to do other things more often. It can carry a piece of food back toward the group. It can hold an infant against the body while the feet keep moving. It can pick up a stone, turn it, test its weight, feel its edge, and remember how it changed when it struck another stone. In the deep African background of human origins, the free hand was not a symbol of power, it was an opening for attention. The first home of the human story was a place where noticing the world with the body mattered. The eye saw a shape, the foot felt the ground, the ear caught a sound, but the hand could explore in a slower way. It could touch bark, bone, shell, fruit, mud, skin, and stone. It could compare, it could repeat. It could learn that some materials break, some bend, some cut, some hold, and some fail. Long before Homo sapiens appeared, Earlier hominins were already living through this quiet education. The earliest stone toolmaking known from the archaeological record goes back at least about 2.6 million years, and the older one toolkits were simple when compared with later technologies, hammerstones, cores, and sharp flakes. But simple does not mean meaningless. A sharp flake could open a new relationship with food. A hammerstone could crack something that teeth alone could not easily break. A carried object could become useful somewhere else, away from the place where it was found. This changed the meaning of movement. An early human relative was no longer only passing through a landscape, it could take part of the landscape along with it. In Africa, where water, animals, plants, and seasons could shift, this mattered. A hand that carried a stone carried possibility. A hand that brought food carried memory. A hand that learned from another hand carried culture in its earliest, quietest form. We must be careful not to imagine these early tool users as modern thinkers in ancient bodies. They did not sit down with plans in the way later humans would. They did not know they were beginning a technological story. Much of what happened may have been practical, repeated, and learned through watching. One body struck stone, another noticed. One young member copied the movement badly, then better. One group found a useful place for raw material, and the memory of that place could matter again. The hand became linked with the group, not just with the individual. This is one reason the origin of human life in Africa cannot be told only through skulls and dates. It also has to be told through gestures that vanished. Reaching, holding, sharing, pointing, offering, refusing, showing. Fossils can preserve bones, and tools can preserve broken stone, but most of hand life disappeared without leaving a trace. A mother's grip, an older person's demonstration, a child's first attempt to copy, a quiet exchange of food at dusk, these were not preserved in the ground, yet they may have shaped what being human slowly became. The free hand also changed the meaning of weakness. A creature without large teeth or claws could begin to live through objects, memory, and cooperation. This did not make early humans safe. It made them more flexible. On the African landscapes where the human line was forming, flexibility may have mattered more than strength. A stone edge, a carried tool, a shared skill, a remembered source of material, each one was small. Together, across long time, they helped prepare the conditions for Homo sapiens. So the hand is not only part of the body. In this story, it is part of the first home. Africa shaped the hand by giving it problems to solve slowly. How to feed, how to carry, how to teach, how to survive when the land changed again. Before human language could explain origin, the hand was already answering the land in silence. The road before Homo sapiens was not only a road of bones, feet, and hands, it was also a road of slow changes inside the body, inside the brain, and inside the group. But this change should not be imagined as a sudden awakening, as if one morning an early human opened its eyes and became like us. For millions of years in Africa, the human line changed by small degrees. Brain size increased slowly at first. Bodies changed in shape and endurance. Teeth, jaws, hands, legs, and hips all carried signs of shifting ways of life. Some changes helped movement, some helped feeding, some helped carrying. Some helped a creature live, not only through muscle, but through memory and cooperation. This matters because Africa, as the first home of the human story, did not create modern humans in a single moment. It held a long preparation. Long before Homo sapiens appeared, earlier human relatives were already learning what kind of body could survive in a changing land. A larger brain was not simply a gift, it was costly. A brain needs energy, it needs food, it needs time to grow. A baby with a developing brain needs care for a long period. A group with such young cannot live only by quick movement and instinct. It must protect, feed, wait, and remember. In this sense, the growth of the brain and the growth of social life were tied together. The mind did not rise alone. It rose inside bodies that needed other bodies. It rose beside mothers, children, older members, watchers, tool users, food sharers, and learners. If we ask why the quiet origin of human life belongs so deeply to Africa, Part of the answer is that African environments gave early humans no single simple lesson. A dry season might reward memory. A dangerous crossing might reward caution. A scattered food source might reward sharing. A useful stone might reward attention. A child watching an adult might reward patience. Over time, the group itself became part of survival. What one individual did not know, another might remember. What one pair of eyes missed, another might see. What one hand could not carry, several hands could move. This was not civilization yet. It was not language as we know it. It was not culture in the later written sense, but it was the beginning of a deeper pattern. Humans becoming creatures whose lives depended on learning from one another. The body and the group changed together. As early Homo species appeared and spread through parts of Africa and beyond, the old human story became more complex. Homo erectus, for example, had a larger body and brain than earlier forms, and its long existence suggests a strong ability to live across different environments. But even here, we should avoid turning evolution into a heroic ladder. Homo erectus was not a failed version of us, nor was it simply a step waiting to become us. It was its own successful human form for a very long time. The same is true for other human relatives. They remind us that the path to Homo sapiens was branching, not straight. Africa was not a factory producing one final model. It was a vast, living continent where many human possibilities existed, some continuing, some ending, some leaving traces in bone and stone. By the time Homo sapiens finally appeared in Africa, the body had inherited a deep past: upright walking, free hands, tool use, social dependence, growing brains, long childhoods, and the need to learn in groups. None of these began as modern human identity. They were older habits shaped by survival. This makes the first home of our species feel even more profound. Africa was not only where Homo sapiens began, it was where the conditions for becoming Homo sapiens had been forming for millions of years. Before there was a human name for memory, memory was already useful. Before there was a human word for care, care was already necessary. Before there was a human story about origin, origin was being written quietly in bodies that needed one another to live. Around 300,000 years ago, in Africa, something appeared that was close enough to us that we give it our own name, Homo sapiens. But even this sentence can mislead us if we hear it too quickly. It can make the beginning sound like a door opening, as if one generation belonged to the old world and the next generation suddenly became human. The real story was quieter than that. Homo sapiens did not arrive as a finished creature with a clear mind, a complete language, and a destiny to fill the earth. The earliest members of our species were still part of the same living pressure that had shaped earlier human relatives for millions of years. They needed water, they needed food, they needed one another. They lived under African skies that shifted between wet and dry, open and sheltered, generous and difficult. When we ask, was Africa our first home? This is the moment many people want to point to because it gives the story a date, but the date is not a birthday in the simple sense. It is more like a marker placed beside a long river saying, by this point, the human line had taken a form we can begin to recognize. Fossils from places such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco have helped push the known presence of early Homo sapiens back to about 300,000 years ago. Yet those fossils do not show a modern human appearing all at once in the full shape we know today. They show a mixture, a face that seems familiar, and other features that remind us of an older past. That mixture is important. It tells us that becoming human was not a clean break. It was a transition held inside bodies. The first home of Homo sapiens was not a single cradle where perfection appeared. It was a changing continent where older and newer traits overlapped, where populations may have lived apart, met again, exchanged genes, or disappeared from the record without leaving a name. In this way, Africa becomes not only the place where our species began, but the place where the beginning itself was spread out, uneven and patient. A person listening at night may imagine a quiet landscape: stone, dust, low plants, distant animals, and a small group moving carefully through morning light. They would not have known they were early Homo sapiens. They would not have thought of themselves as the origin of anyone. Their concern was closer and simpler. Where is water today? Which path is safe? What can be eaten? Who is missing? Which child is tired? Which older memory should be trusted? These questions were not small. They were the actual shape of life. The origin of human life was not born in an idea, but in repeated needs. It lived in walking, watching, sharing, resting, fearing, returning, and trying again. The phrase Homo sapiens appeared in Africa can sound scientific and distant, but beneath it is an intimate truth. Before our species spread into many lands and took on many appearances, its earliest known roots were already tied to African environments that demanded flexibility. A dry period could separate groups. A greener period could open paths. A lake edge could support life for generations, then withdraw. A region that was home for one group might become impossible for another. This made Africa less like a fixed birthplace and more like a moving school of survival. To begin there meant learning under change. It meant that our species did not first become human in comfort, but in adjustment. So the meaning of 300,000 years ago is not that the human story suddenly became clear. It is that, within Africa, a long preparation had reached a recognizable form. The body was familiar, but still ancient. The mind was capable, but still shaped by daily risk. The group was necessary, but still small beneath the sky. And the first home of Homo sapiens was not yet a memory. It was simply the world they had to live through. To say that Homo sapiens appeared in Africa can make the story sound sharper than it really was. A name gives the mind a clean edge. It makes us imagine a before and an after, an old creature and a new creature, a moment when the human story crossed an invisible line. But nature rarely works with such clean lines. The beginning of our species was not a single spark in the dark. It was a long transition, spread across bodies, regions, generations, and changing environments. Some features became more like ours before others did. A face could look more modern, while the brain case still held an older shape. A tool could be useful without belonging to a fully modern culture. A group could behave with care, planning, and memory without leaving enough evidence for us to know exactly how they thought. This is why the origin of human life in Africa must be imagined slowly. It was not one morning when the first true human stood up and the world changed. It was many mornings, many dry seasons, many births, many deaths, many small inheritances passed from body to body. The fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco help us feel this complexity. They are often described as among the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils, dating to about 300,000 years ago, but they do not show a finished version of modern humanity. They show a mixture of familiar and older traits. That mixture is not a problem in the story. It is the story. It reminds us that a species is not born like a child with a single breath. A species is recognized later by people looking backward, comparing bones, tools, DNA, and landscapes. The individuals themselves simply lived. They did not know that future humans would place them near the beginning of our name. They did not know that their faces, teeth, skulls, and tools would become evidence. They only knew the nearness of water, the weight of heat, the movement of animals, the safety of others, and the difficulty of staying alive. In that sense, the first home of Homo sapiens was not a dramatic birthplace. It was a long field of becoming. Across Africa, different human groups may have carried different combinations of traits. Some were connected at times, some were separated by deserts, forests, mountains, distance, or climate. When wetter periods opened green corridors, groups could move and meet. When dry periods returned, they could become isolated again. This rhythm matters because it makes the African origin of humans broader than a single cave or fossil site. A site can preserve a moment. A continent holds the process. The quiet origin of human life may have involved many populations, not one small group sitting at the center of everything. This does not weaken the idea that Africa was our first home, it deepens it. A first home does not have to be a single room. It can be a wide landscape where related groups lived through different conditions and slowly became part of the same human inheritance. The word transition also helps us avoid a false conclusion. Earlier, humans were not meaningless simply because they were not us. They were not failed drafts. They were living forms adapted to their own worlds. Homo sapiens came from a longer family of human relatives, and the features we now call modern were gathered slowly from that older background. Upright walking, free hands, tool use, longer childhood, social learning, memory, and care all had roots before our species. When Homo sapiens emerged, these older traits did not vanish. They continued inside a new combination. The human beginning was not a rejection of the past. It was the past rearranged. So when we return to the title, "Was Africa our first home?" the answer should not be rushed into a simple yes and left there. Africa was our first home because the earliest known roots of Homo sapiens are there, but it was also our first home because the becoming of our species happened there slowly, across a continent large enough to hold separation and connection at the same time. The first home was not a point, it was a process. It was not a perfect beginning. It was an unfinished life, learning how to continue. If Africa was our first home, it was not because one small corner of the continent suddenly made all of humanity by itself. The older picture of human origins often sounds like a single cradle, one place, one population, one narrow beginning. That image is simple, and simple images are easy to remember. But the deeper story of Homo sapiens in Africa appears wider and more patient. Africa is not a small room. It is a continent of deserts, forests, lakes, savannas, mountains, coasts, river systems, highlands, and changing corridors of life. Over long periods, these environments could connect people or separate them. A wet period might open a path where animals, plants, and human groups could move. A dry period might close that same path and leave groups living apart for generations. In this rhythm of separation and return, different populations could carry different pieces of the human future. Some may have developed certain body forms, some may have kept useful skills in particular landscapes, some may have survived in places that later became difficult or empty, some may have left no trace we have found. This does not mean there were many separate human origins in the sense of unrelated beginnings. It means the African origin of Homo sapiens may have been structured, spread out, and connected by movement over time. The first home was not a single dot, it was a living network. Fossils and archaeology help us feel this. Early Homo sapiens fossils do not all tell one identical story from one region. They show variation, and variation is exactly what we might expect from a large continent where groups lived under different pressures. The tools and behaviors found in different African regions also suggest local traditions and adaptations, rather than one simple center sending the same way of life everywhere at once. A group near stone-rich ground might learn one relationship with material. A group near water might carry other habits of food, movement, and watching. A group in more open land might learn distance, timing, and exposure in another way. Over many generations, these differences did not have to divide humanity forever. They could become part of a shared inheritance when groups met, mixed, learned, or moved through the same corridors again. This is why the idea of Africa as our first home should feel larger than a cradle. A cradle holds one infant. Africa held populations. It held experiments in survival, memory, skill, and social life. It held human groups that were not yet separated into the later identities we know, but also not all the same. Their differences were ancient, practical, and tied to land. Their connection was older than nations, older than race, older than any story they could have told about themselves. When we say all living humans trace deep ancestry to Africa, we are not saying everyone came from one tiny camp beside one fire. We are saying our species has its deepest known roots in African populations whose lives formed the base of the modern human story. The quietness of this truth matters. It does not need to make one place sacred and all other places secondary. Instead, it makes the human beginning more humble. The source of our species was not pure and narrow. It was mixed with distance, climate, movement, and time. It was shaped by many ordinary groups doing what life required: finding food, raising children, watching the land, surviving drought, remembering water, learning tools, meeting others, and sometimes disappearing. Some of these groups may have contributed directly to later humans, others may not have. But even the vanished ones remind us that becoming human was not guaranteed. The human story that continued was only one part of a wider African human world. So the answer to the title grows deeper here. Was Africa our first home? Yes, but not as a single birthplace frozen in one landscape. Africa was our first home as a vast, changing continent where many related human populations lived through different worlds and slowly became connected to the ancestry of Homo sapiens. The beginning of human life was not a straight line out of one point. It was more like scattered lights across a dark plain, some fading, some meeting, some carrying the glow forward until, much later, the world would call that light human. The climate that shaped the human mind did not work like a single disaster. It worked more slowly, through return and withdrawal, through seasons that came differently, through lakes that grew and shrank, through rivers that held life for a time and then left dry marks behind. In Africa, where the deep origin of Homo sapiens belongs, water was never only water. It was movement, safety, food, memory, and risk. A lake could gather animals, plants, birds, insects, and human groups around its edge. A wet season could open a green path across land that had once been difficult to cross. A dry season could narrow life into fewer places, making every remaining source of water more important. For early humans and their ancestors, this meant that home was not always fixed. The same place that felt familiar in one generation might become harder in another. A shoreline could move away, a riverbed could change, a patch of woodland could thin, grass could spread where trees had once offered shade. None of this needed to be dramatic in the way stories often become dramatic. It could be quiet, gradual, almost ordinary, until the group had to move, remember, or change its habits. This is one reason the African beginning of human life cannot be separated from climate. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa during a long background of environmental instability, and earlier human relatives had already lived for millions of years under changing conditions. The land did not teach by speaking, it taught by changing the distance between need and answer. If water was near, life could gather. If water disappeared, knowledge had to stretch farther. A group that remembered more places had a better chance than a group that knew only one. A person who had seen a dry year before might become valuable when the dry year returned. An older memory could become as important as a young body. In this way, climate did not simply press on the outside of human life. It entered the social world. It made memory useful. It made attention necessary. It made movement part of belonging. The first home of Homo sapiens was therefore not a stable room, but a changing field of decisions. Where should the group rest when the heat grows heavier? When should it leave a place that still feels familiar but no longer gives enough? Which animal paths lead toward water? Which clouds mean rain nearby, and which only pass without relief? These are not questions of modern science, but they are questions of survival, and they belong directly to the quiet origin of the human mind. A mind does not become flexible in a world that never asks it to bend. It becomes flexible where the same answer is not always enough. Africa, in this sense, shaped early humans through repeated uncertainty. The continent held deserts and green corridors, dry plains and river valleys, lake basins and highlands, places of shelter and places of exposure. These differences mattered because they made human life depend on adjustment rather than routine alone. The group that survived could not treat the land as a permanent promise. It had to read the land as a changing relationship. Food might be plentiful after rain, then scattered later. Animals might gather in one season, then move beyond reach. Plants that were useful in one place might not grow in another. Even stone, shade, and safe sleeping places had to be found, remembered, and sometimes abandoned. When we ask whether Africa was our first home, this is the kind of home we are really asking about. Not a peaceful origin, where everything waited for us, but a living environment that trained human beings to notice change before change became fatal. Later, when Homo sapiens moved beyond Africa, that deeper inheritance would matter. They did not carry only bodies. They carried the old habit of watching land, weather, water, and each other. They carried a mind shaped by a continent where survival often depended on seeing that the world had shifted even before it fully announced itself. To live in the first human home was to read signs long before reading words existed. The ground itself became a kind of text, but not one written for humans alone. It was shared by animals, wind, water, roots, insects, and time. A bend in the grass could mean that something large had passed before dawn. A broken branch might be only weather, or it might be the memory of a body moving through shade. Mud near water could hold the marks of hooves, paws, birds, and human feet. The smell of wet soil after a dry stretch could tell a group that rain had touched a nearby place, even if the sky above them remained clear. In Africa, where Homo sapiens would eventually appear, this kind of attention was not decoration, it was survival. The early human mind did not grow apart from the land. It grew by returning to the land again and again, learning that the world was full of small signals that mattered. A group that could notice water signs, animal movement, seasonal fruit, dry grass, distant storms, and the behavior of other creatures had more than knowledge, it had a way to continue. This is why climate and landscape belong directly to the origin of human life. They made the mind practical before it became philosophical. They made memory useful before memory became story. When a group followed animals, it was not only following meat, it was following information. Animals knew where water collected, where shade remained, where danger gathered, and where the land changed first. Birds could announce movement, scavengers could reveal death. Antelope could show nervousness before a predator was seen. Even silence could become meaningful if the group had learned what ordinary sound should be. These lessons were not learned in one lifetime only. They passed through watching, copying, correcting, and remembering. A child did not need a written lesson to learn that certain tracks near water meant caution. A young adult did not need a map to learn that clouds over distant high ground could change the day's path. An older person did not need a calendar to remember when a certain plant might return after rain. The first home of Homo sapiens was full of these quiet forms of knowledge. They were not dramatic, but they joined the body to the world. The eye, hand, ear, nose, and foot all became part of a single attentiveness. In a continent of shifting lakes, dry corridors, green returns, and animal migrations, survival favored not only strength, but responsiveness. Smithsonian's Human Origins program describes human evolution as occurring alongside cooling, drying, and wider climate fluctuations, and explains the idea of variability selection, where changing surroundings favored the ability to adjust rather than one fixed response. That does not mean every change in human behavior can be reduced to climate. It means the background of instability made flexibility valuable. The early human group had to treat the world as something alive with change. A place could not be trusted simply because it had been safe before. A river that gave life in one season could shrink in another. A resting place near water could become crowded with animals and predators. A patch of fruit could feed the group for a time, then vanish until another cycle. So the mind had to become a watcher of patterns, not perfect patterns, not certain predictions, but enough to guide the next movement, the next pause, the next choice. This is one of the most important meanings of Africa as our first home. It was not merely the place where bodies existed, it was the place where bodies learned to become attentive together. The land asked questions every day without words. Where is the water now? Which animal passed here? Is the wind carrying danger? Has the season turned? Should the group remain? or move before hunger decides for them? These questions did not create modern science, but they prepared the human habit of asking. They taught that the visible world could contain hidden causes. A track meant a body, a cloud meant possible rain, a smell meant change. A flock lifting suddenly into the air meant something had disturbed the ground below. Long before humans asked where they came from, they were already asking what the world was telling them. And in that slow exchange between land and mind, the African beginning of humanity became more than a place of origin. It became the first classroom of attention. Flexibility did not begin as an idea. It began as a way of staying alive. In the African landscapes where the human story took its earliest shape, no group could survive for long by trusting only one habit, one path, one food, or one sheltering place. The world changed too often for that. A lake that once drew animals close could shrink until the old paths no longer worked. A rainy season could return late. A dry wind could make familiar ground feel strange. Plants could ripen in one place and fail in another. Herds could move beyond reach. A place that had been safe in memory could become dangerous in the present. In such a world, the creature that survived was not always the strongest creature. It was often the one that could adjust before it was too late. This is one of the quiet lessons of human origin in Africa. The human mind was shaped not only to know, but to change what it did when old knowledge stopped being enough. Smithsonian's Human Origins program describes this idea through the term variability selection, the hypothesis that changing environments favored traits that helped human ancestors adapt to uncertainty and habitat. Diversity. The meaning is simple enough to feel deeply human. A fixed answer may work in a fixed world, but a changing world rewards a mind that can compare, pause, remember, and try another way. This does not mean climate alone created humans, and it does not mean every part of human life can be explained by weather. It means that, in the long African background of our species, environmental instability made flexibility valuable. A group that knew only one water source might suffer when that water disappeared. A group that remembered several places, watched animal movement, shared information, and changed course could live a little longer. Over thousands of generations, that difference mattered. Flexibility entered the human story through ordinary acts, leaving earlier, waiting longer, trying a different food, using a stone in a new way, resting in a different place, trusting an older memory, following a younger person's fresh observation, sharing a burden, or dividing attention across the group. None of these acts looked grand, yet together they formed a pattern. Human survival became less tied to a single perfect adaptation and more tied to the ability to respond. Africa, as our first home, was not one stable environment that shaped one narrow kind of creature. It was a wide, shifting continent where hominins faced cooling, drying, changing seasons and wider ecological variation across long spans of time. In that setting, a flexible creature could become at home in more than one kind of place. It could live near water, but not only near water. It could move across open ground, but also use shelter. It could eat one kind of food, but learn another when the season changed. It could remember old paths, but also notice when old paths failed. This is why adaptability feels so central to the human story. It is not a modern achievement, it is an old inheritance. Before Homo sapiens spread far beyond Africa, the human line had already been trained by African change to live with uncertainty. The mind that later crossed deserts, coastlines, forests, mountains, and cold northern lands did not begin from emptiness. It came from a first home where change had already become familiar. The quiet origin of human life may therefore be understood as a long education in not being trapped by one answer. When the land changed, the group had to change. When water moved, memory had to move with it. When food disappeared, the hand, eye, and mind had to search differently. When danger gathered, the group had to read the signs again. To be human was slowly becoming a way of asking, what has changed and what must be done now? That question began close to the ground, in dust, grass, stone, heat, rain, thirst, and shared attention. It was not yet philosophy, it was survival. But inside that survival was the beginning of something that would later define us, the ability to carry the past without being imprisoned by it. A human being alone is easy to imagine, but difficult to place at the beginning of our story. In the first home of Homo sapiens, the small group mattered more than the lonely individual. Africa did not shape human life by creating isolated heroes moving across the land without need. It shaped bodies and minds that depended on one another. A single person could see only one direction at a time. A group could watch the grass, the water, the children, the distance, and the shadows at once. A single person could forget a path, misread a sign, or fail under hunger. A group could carry more memory than one mind. Someone might remember where water remained during a past dry season. Someone else might know which fruit became safe only after a certain change in color. Another might notice animal nervousness before danger appeared. This was not modern organization. It was older and quieter. It was survival shared among bodies. When we speak of Africa as our first home, we should not picture only land, climate, and fossils. We should also picture the warmth and tension of small groups under a changing sky. Home was not only where the ground was familiar, home was where familiar faces made the ground survivable. The early Homo sapiens who lived in Africa more than 300,000 years ago still spent much of life finding food through gathering, hunting, and scavenging, and they lived long before farming, cities, or written rules. In such a world, the group was a kind of living shelter. It could not stop drought. It could not command animals to come closer. It could not make night harmless. But it could reduce the weight of being alone. Sharing food, caring for infants, and building social bonds are recognized as central parts of early human survival. The meaning is simple. Human life became safer when it was not carried by one body only. A child needed more than birth to survive. A mother needed help, especially when carrying, feeding, and protecting a child in a landscape where danger did not pause. An injured adult might live if others brought food or waited. An older person might be slower, but still important because memory could outlast strength. The first human groups were not perfect, peaceful circles. They would have known tension, loss, competition, fear, and uncertainty. But they also held something deeply important for human origin, the possibility that one life could be supported by another. This is where the human mind became social in a practical way. To live in a group, a person had to notice not only weather and tracks, but also faces, moods, needs, silence, anger, trust, fatigue, and attention. The African landscape asked humans to read the outside world, but group life asked them to read one another. That second form of reading may be one of the quietest foundations of being human. If someone was frightened, others might become alert. If a child cried too long, the group might have to stop, hide, or move differently. If someone found food, the question was not only how to eat, but whether to share, with whom, and what that sharing meant later. These small social choices created memory inside the group. Who helped before, who knew the path, who could be trusted near children, who noticed danger first. None of this required writing. None of it required laws. It required repeated life together. Africa, as the first home of Homo sapiens, was the place where these ordinary social patterns became part of survival under real pressure. Before humans built houses, they built nearness. Before they made nations, they made belonging small enough to recognize by voice and face. Before they asked where humanity came from, they were already answering another question every day. How can fragile beings survive in a changing world? One answer was the group. Not the group as an idea, but the group as shared watching, shared hunger, shared memory, shared care, and shared sleep beneath the same uncertain sky. Inside the small groups of early human life, survival was not carried by one kind of person. It was carried by many quiet roles, most of them too ordinary to leave clear marks in stone or bone. When we imagine the first home of Homo sapiens in Africa, it is easy to picture a hunter walking across open ground or a toolmaker striking stone beside a fire. But the deeper human story also lived in slower gestures: a mother shifting the weight of an infant, an older person remembering where water had remained before, a child learning which hands to trust, a tired adult sharing food because tomorrow someone else might need the same kindness. These acts were not small simply because they were gentle. In a changing African environment, care could be a survival strategy. A baby did not survive by strength. A child did not learn the land alone. A mother could not safely carry every burden without help from others. A group that protected its young was protecting its future memory. This is why the origin of human life cannot be told only through movement, tools, and climate. It must also be told through dependency. Humans became human inside relationships, where weakness did not always mean abandonment. The young were especially important because human childhood is long. A longer childhood gives the brain time to grow and the mind time to learn, but it also creates a cost. Young humans need food, protection, patience, and repeated teaching before they can fully support themselves. In the first African home of our species, this meant that the group had to make space for slowness. A child had to watch adults break stone, gather plants, follow tracks, avoid danger, recognize voices, and understand the rhythm of moving and resting. Much of this learning would not have looked like formal teaching. It may have been copying, staying near, being corrected by experience, and slowly joining the habits of the group. The elderly, too, may have held a quiet value. Not every older member could move quickly or carry heavy loads, but memory itself could become useful in a land of changing water, seasons, plants, and animal paths. An older person who remembered a harsh, dry period might know when a familiar place was becoming dangerous. Someone who had seen many births, wounds, losses, and returns could carry knowledge no young body had yet earned. This does not mean every group treated every old person the same, and we should not romanticize the past as perfectly kind. But it does suggest that human survival was often more complex than simple strength. A group could depend on speed, skill, memory, watchfulness, patience, and care at the same time. The roles of gathering, hunting, carrying, watching, making, feeding, and guiding were not separate from the African origin of Homo sapiens. They were how origin happened day after day. Some members may have gone farther to search for food, some may have stayed closer to children, some may have known plants better, some may have understood animal movement better, some may have been skilled with stone, wood, bone, or fire. Some may have been valuable because they calmed fear, noticed tension, or kept the group from breaking apart. These roles were not job titles, they were living contributions. In a world without written rules, a group remembered usefulness through experience. Who returned with food, who shared, who warned others, who protected the small ones, who knew when to leave. Who could be followed when the land became uncertain? Africa, as our first home, shaped these roles because it did not allow one simple way of surviving. The first human group was not only a biological unit, it was a web of attention. Every person's vulnerability created a need, and every useful memory or gesture could become part of the group's strength. Before humans built villages, they built reliance. Before they wrote laws, they learned expectations. Before they described morality, they lived through the daily question of whether one body would help another continue. In that quiet question beneath the African sky, the social heart of human life was already beginning to take shape. Before writing, there was memory. Before records, there were bodies that remembered where they had walked, what they had eaten, whom they had trusted, and what the land had done before. In the first home of Homo sapiens, this kind of memory did not belong to one person only. It lived across the group. One member might remember a water place from childhood. Another might remember the sound of animals moving before rain. Another might know where stone of a certain kind could be found. Another might remember who had once helped during hunger or who had failed when danger came close. These memories were not stored in books, marks, or carved signs. They were stored in repeated movement, repeated warning, repeated gesture, repeated watching. A young person learned by staying near older people and seeing what they noticed. A child learned that some plants were touched and others were avoided. A group learned that a path was worth taking because someone had taken it before. This is why the origin of human life in Africa cannot be understood only through fossils. Fossils show us bones. Tools show us broken stone. But the living memory that held a group together mostly vanished each time a voice fell silent. The earliest human knowledge was fragile because it needed living people to carry it. And yet it was powerful because it allowed one lifetime to help another. In a changing African world where water, animals, plants, and seasons could shift, memory became a quiet form of protection. A group did not need to understand climate in a modern scientific way to know that the land had patterns. It only needed to remember enough to act. When the dry season deepened, an older memory might guide movement. When a child became sick after eating something, the lesson might remain in the group long after the pain passed. When animals avoided a certain place, people might remember caution there. This was knowledge before writing, and it belonged directly to home. A home is not only where bodies sleep, it is where memories gather enough weight to guide the next day. Africa, as our first home, was the first great landscape where the human line learned to carry such memory socially, not perfectly, not peacefully, not without loss. A drought could erase what a group knew. A death could take away a path. A migration could break a chain of remembered places. But as long as people lived together, memory could move from one body to another. A gesture could say, "Come this way." A sound could warn, "Not there." A shared meal could teach what was safe. A repeated route could become almost invisible knowledge, known in the feet before it was spoken in words. Long before writing appeared much later in human history, humans were already symbolic and social in ways that helped knowledge travel. The earliest forms may have been simple: showing, pointing, mimicking, calling, rhythm, facial expression, and eventually more complex speech. We do not know every detail of when language as we know it fully emerged, and it would be dishonest to pretend certainty where the evidence is limited. But we can safely say that social learning was central to human survival. Sharing food, caring for infants, and building social bonds helped early humans meet the daily challenges of their environments, and the ability to learn from one another became one of the deep strengths of the human line. In this sense, group memory was not separate from cooperation. It was cooperation stretched across time. If one person learned something and another person could use it later, then the group had become more than a gathering of bodies. It had become a keeper of experience. This is one of the quietest meanings of Africa as our first human home. It was where the long human habit of remembering together took root before history had a written form. The first stories may not have been stories in the way we know them now. They may have been warnings, names for places, sounds for animals, gestures toward water, or remembered paths retold in simple ways. But even before full story, there was continuity. The group carried yesterday into tomorrow, and somewhere in that fragile carrying, the human beginning became deeper than survival alone. It became inheritance. The first human skills were quiet because they were not created to impress the future. They were created to answer hunger, cold, distance, danger, and the daily problem of staying alive. In the African background of human origins, a tool did not begin as a symbol of intelligence. It began as something held in the hand because the body alone was not enough. A stone could be picked up, tested, struck, broken, carried, lost, found again, or shown to another pair of eyes. The earliest stone toolmaking known in the archaeological record reaches back at least about 2.6 million years, long before Homo sapiens appeared. These Oldowan tools were simple compared with later human technology, hammerstones, cores, and sharp flakes. But their simplicity is what makes them powerful in the story. A sharp flake could cut, a heavy stone could pound, a broken edge could open food that teeth and nails alone could not easily reach. In the first home of the human line, This changed the relationship between body and landscape. The hand was no longer only touching the world, it was beginning to reshape small parts of it. This did not mean early humans suddenly became masters of nature. A stone tool could not stop drought. It could not make predators vanish. It could not guarantee food for a child, but it gave a fragile creature another way to respond. That is why tools belong so deeply to the question of Africa as our first home. They show that survival in this changing continent was not only about stronger bodies, but about useful habits repeated through time. Food, too, was part of this quiet intelligence. Early humans and their relatives did not live from one perfect source. They gathered, hunted, scavenged, watched, tested, and learned from what the land allowed. A bone left by another predator might become an opportunity. A plant that returned after rain might become remembered knowledge. A shell, root, seed, fruit, or piece of meat could teach the group something about place and season. The body needed energy, and the growing human brain made energy even more important. But finding food was not simply a physical act. It required timing, memory, attention, and sometimes cooperation. One person could find, another could watch, another could carry. Another could remember where the same kind of food had appeared before. In this way, eating became part of learning. The African landscape fed the human line, but not by giving without difficulty. It fed those who could notice, return, adapt, and share. Fire must be spoken of carefully, because the evidence for when humans first controlled and made fire is difficult and uneven. Fire does not preserve itself easily. Burned traces can be confused, moved, or lost. Some evidence is late, some is debated, and different human groups may have used fire in different ways at different times. Yet once fire became a controlled part of human life, its meaning was enormous. It could warm the night, change food, keep some animals away, extend waking time, and gather bodies near one light. But for this part of the story, we should not rush. We should imagine fire not as a sudden miracle, but as another quiet skill that had to be learned, guarded, repeated, and understood. A flame is useful only if people know how to keep it, approach it, feed it, and respect its danger. Like stone, like food, like water, fire demanded attention. These first skills were not separate from social learning. A young member of the group could watch how an older hand struck stone. Someone could see where another person looked for roots. A child could learn from being stopped before touching danger. A group could gather around a useful place and repeat what worked. Long before written teaching, the first lessons passed through eyes, hands, pauses, corrections, and imitation. Africa, as our first home, was not only the place where Homo sapiens eventually appeared, it was the place where the human line learned that survival could be carried through skill. A stone edge, a remembered food, a careful flame, and a watching child may seem small beside the vastness of evolution, but these small things are where the human story becomes intimate. They show that becoming human was not only a change in bones or brains, it was a change in how life answered the world, one quiet skill at a time. Care was one of the first human skills, though it did not look like a skill in the way a stone tool does. It left fewer sharp edges in the ground. It did not always leave marks that could be measured. But without care, the human story would have been thinner, shorter, and more fragile. In the African landscapes where Homo sapiens first appeared, survival did not belong only to the strongest body or the fastest runner. It also belonged to the group that could keep its weakest members alive long enough for memory, learning, and belonging to continue. A child could not survive by bravery. An infant could not follow a moving group by will. A sick person could not always gather food. An injured adult could not always protect themselves. Care entered the human story because bodies failed and because other bodies sometimes answered. This does not mean early humans lived in perfect kindness. They knew hunger, tension, fear, and loss. But the fact that human young require long protection made care more than emotion. It became part of survival itself. A group that helped mothers had a better chance of helping children live. A group that shared food could carry one member through a bad day, knowing that another day the need might belong to someone else. A group that waited for the slow, watched over the tired, or protected the small was not simply being gentle, it was protecting the future of its own knowledge. Africa, as our first home, shaped this care under real pressure. The land did not become easy because people cared for one another. Water still moved, food still disappeared, predators still watched, heat still weakened bodies. But care changed what weakness meant. Weakness did not always have to end in abandonment. Sometimes it called the group closer, around a resting place, near shade, near fire when fire was available, near food that had been gathered. The social body of the group could become a shelter that no tree or cave could fully replace. The first human home was not only earth beneath the feet, it was the nearness of others who knew your voice, your face, your hunger, your fear, and your place in the group. This kind of care also changed learning. A child who was kept alive longer had more time to watch, more time to copy the way stone was struck, the way plants were chosen, the way danger was noticed, the way water was remembered. A long childhood is costly, but it gives the human mind room to grow inside relationship. The young learn not only from instruction, but from being near enough to observe repeated life. They learn who shares, who warns, who comforts, who leads, who notices, who remembers. In this way, care becomes a bridge between generations. It carries more than survival from one body to another. It carries habits, it carries caution, it carries the quiet map of the first home. The same may have been true for older members. An older body might move more slowly, but a long memory could still matter in a continent of changing seasons and uncertain water. If someone remembered a place that had held water before, or a plant that returned after rain, or a path that should be avoided in a certain season, that memory could help the group. Care for the old, when it occurred, was not only sentiment. It could also preserve experience. The human group became stronger when it carried different kinds of value: strength, attention, memory, patience, skill, and tenderness. This is why care belongs beside tools and fire in the quiet origin of human life. A tool extended the hand. Fire, when controlled, changed the night. But care extended the life of the group across vulnerability. It allowed the unfinished child to become a learner. It allowed the injured body to remain part of the circle. It allowed memory to survive in people who were no longer the fastest. In Africa, before nations, before writing, before history knew its own name, human beings were learning that survival was not only the art of taking from the world, it was also the art of keeping one another alive long enough to remember it. Strength is easy to see. Patience is harder to notice. A strong animal leaves a deep mark in the imagination: teeth, speed, size, muscle, the power to strike or flee. But the quiet origin of human life in Africa suggests that strength alone was never enough. The early human line did not become important because it had the heaviest body or the sharpest claws. It survived because it could wait, watch, repeat, copy, remember, and learn. These are slower abilities. They do not look dramatic from a distance. A hand striking stone again and again until one edge breaks correctly is not a heroic scene. A child watching an older person choose a plant is not an event that shakes the earth. A group waiting until heat softens before moving is not a victory song. Yet these small patient acts may have mattered more than force. In the changing African landscapes where Homo sapiens eventually appeared, rushing could be dangerous. A wrong food could sicken. A wrong path could waste energy. A wrong movement near water could bring a group too close to predators. A wrong season could turn a familiar place into a place of hunger. Patience gave the mind time to compare the present with memory. It allowed the group to ask, without words or with only simple signs, whether this place was still safe, whether the animals were moving differently, whether the clouds promised rain or only passed above them. Learning also required humility before the land. The first human skills were not invented once and then finished forever. A stone tool had to be made again. A food source had to be found again. A useful path had to be remembered again. Fire, when controlled, had to be guarded again. Care had to be offered again. Survival was repetition under changing conditions. This is why Africa, as the first home of our species, should not be imagined only as a place of origin, but as a place of practice. The continent trained early humans through tasks that returned with small differences. The dry season was not always the same dry season. A lake edge was not always the same edge. A group was not always made of the same bodies, because children grew, adults weakened, old members died, and new children needed to learn. In such a world, learning could not be stored in one moment. It had to keep moving through the group. Patience made that movement possible. A young person needed time to become useful. An older person needed time to show. A difficult skill needed repeated failure before it became dependable. Even social life required patience. To live near others, early humans had to tolerate noise, hunger, fear, anger, slowness, and need. A group that broke apart too easily lost its shared memory. A group that stayed together long enough could hold more knowledge than any one person. This does not mean early humans were peaceful or wise in a modern moral sense. It means that, under African skies where uncertainty was ordinary, the ability to learn together was a real survival advantage. Strength could solve one moment. Learning could change many future moments. Strength could carry food today. Memory could help find food again when today had passed. Strength could protect a child from one danger. Care and teaching could help that child become a keeper of the group's knowledge. In this quiet way, patience became part of the human inheritance. It helped turn experience into habit, habit into skill, and skill into something that could survive beyond one body. Before Homo sapiens left Africa in lasting ways, the human line had already learned that the world was too changeable for power alone. The body had to move, but the mind had to return. The hand had to act, but the eye had to watch. The group had to eat, but it also had to teach. Perhaps this is one reason the origin of human life feels so different from the origin of a stronger animal. Humanity did not begin by defeating the world. It began by learning, slowly, how not to be defeated by it. Africa was never one simple place. To say that humans began in Africa can make the continent sound smaller than it is, as if the first home of Homo sapiens were a single landscape repeated from north to south, east to west, under one kind of sky. But Africa held many worlds. It held forests, where sound could be softened by leaves and shade. It held open grasslands where distance mattered and a moving animal could be seen from far away. It held deserts and dry edges where water became memory before it became thirst. It held river valleys, wetlands, lake basins, rocky shelters, mountains, highlands, and long coastlines where land met sea. These places did not teach the same lessons. A group living near a lake did not face the same daily questions as a group moving through open, dry country. A group near forest edges learned different signs than a group watching animals cross grassland. A group close to the sea could notice tides, shells, birds, fish, and the smell of salt in ways that inland groups did not need to know. This is why the idea of Africa as our first home must become wider here. It was not one room, it was a continent of rooms, each with its own light, danger, food, silence, and rhythm. The origin of Homo sapiens belongs to Africa not because one perfect environment made one perfect creature, but because many environments shaped a flexible one. The human line had already lived through long periods of climate change before modern humans appeared. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, around 300,000 years ago, Africa was not offering a single answer. It was offering many problems, and each problem could reward a different habit. In a forest, patience and close attention might matter. In open land, distance, timing, and group awareness might become more important. In dry places, memory of water could become a kind of life. Near rivers, a group might learn routes that returned again and again. Near stone-rich ground, the hand might learn the feel of useful material. Near the coast, later human groups could find another kind of abundance, but also another kind of uncertainty. None of these environments should be imagined as easy. Each one required knowledge. Each one could support life for a time, and each one could take life away when conditions changed. This diversity helps explain why the human story did not remain narrow. A creature that can live in only one kind of place is bound tightly to that place. A creature that can learn many kinds of places carries home differently. It begins to carry home in memory, tools, social knowledge, food habits, and the ability to read unfamiliar signs. Before humans spread widely beyond Africa, they had already lived within African variety. That long education may have mattered deeply. Recent research has suggested that before the successful later dispersal out of Africa, human populations expanded their ability to live in a wider range of African habitats, including more challenging settings such as forests and arid regions. This does not mean every group lived everywhere or that the process was simple. It means the human niche widened. The circle of possible homes became larger. Africa taught humans that home was not only the place already known. Home could become the place learned carefully enough to survive in. This is one of the quietest strengths of our species. We do not only inherit a body, we inherit a way of adjusting a body to different worlds through culture, memory, cooperation, and attention. When we ask, was Africa our first home? We should not picture only one warm plain with early people walking across it. We should picture a continent teaching many lessons at once: the shadowed lesson of forests, the exposed lesson of grasslands, the severe lesson of dry country, the patient lesson of rivers, the changing lesson of coasts, and the silent lesson of stone. The first home of humanity was not simple, because human life was not becoming simple. It was becoming able to live with difference. Before there were different peoples spread across Earth, there were already different African worlds shaping the same human possibility. Each African environment taught a different kind of human attention. A forest did not ask the same questions as an open plain. A dry basin did not teach the same lessons as a river valley. A coast did not shape movement in the same way as a mountain slope. To live in many kinds of places, early humans could not depend on one fixed habit. They had to let the land change the way they moved, watched, gathered, rested, and remembered. In a forest or woodland, the world could feel close. Sound might travel strangely through leaves. Food could be hidden, scattered, seasonal, and hard to see from a distance. A person had to notice small things: fruit color, broken bark, insect movement, shade, damp ground, the path of animals through plants. In open grassland, the lesson was different. Distance mattered. The eye could travel farther, but so could danger. A group might need to watch the horizon, follow herd movement, find shade, and choose resting places carefully. In dry country, water became the center of memory. A place was not valuable only because it was green today, but because someone remembered whether it had held life before. In river valleys and wetlands, the rhythm of life could be richer, but also more crowded. Animals gathered there. Predators might gather there too. Birds, fish, reeds, mud, tracks, insects, and changing banks could all become part of the group's knowledge. Near the coast, later human groups could learn another kind of pattern: tides, shells, seabirds, wind, salt, and the line where land and water meet. None of these places made humans suddenly modern, but each place could stretch the human mind in a slightly different direction. This is why Africa, as the first home of Homo sapiens, should not be imagined as one setting. It was many teachers. The forest taught closeness. The open plain taught distance. The dry land taught memory. The river taught return. The coast taught rhythm. Stone country taught material. High ground taught visibility and exposure. Every environment asked the same, deeper question in a different voice. Can this group learn what this place requires? That question belongs directly to the origin of human life. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, during a time of dramatic climate change, and like other early humans, they gathered, hunted, and developed behaviors that helped them respond to unstable environments. But the response was never only one behavior. A flexible species had to carry many possible answers. If one place rewarded long-distance movement, another rewarded patience. If one place rewarded memory of water, another rewarded memory of plants. If one place rewarded careful use of stone, another rewarded knowledge of animals, shells, roots, or seasonal paths. Recent research on later prehistoric Africa has also suggested that before the successful expansion beyond Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, human populations had widened their ecological range inside Africa itself, learning to live in diverse and sometimes difficult habitats, including forests and arid regions. That matters for this story because it shows that the ability to adapt was not first learned after leaving the continent. It was already being practiced within the first home. Africa did not prepare humans by keeping them in one kind of world. It prepared them by exposing them to many worlds before the long journey outward became lasting. A listener might imagine this not as a map with arrows, but as many quiet lives spread across different light. One group near a lake waits for birds to return. Another group in dry country remembers a distant water place. Another walks under trees, reading shade and sound. Another follows open land where animals appear and vanish across the horizon. They do not know they are part of one human story. They only know the place in front of them. Yet each place asks for adjustment, and each adjustment becomes part of what humans can be. The first home of humanity was not valuable because it was simple. It was valuable because it made simplicity impossible. It taught humans that survival could mean changing the answer without forgetting the question. Where is food? Where is water? Where is danger? Where are the others? When should we stay? When should we move? Across Africa's many environments, these questions were asked again and again until flexibility became not just something humans did, but something humans carried. Before humans learned to live across the world, they had already learned to live across Africa. This is a quiet but important turn in the story. The journey out of Africa did not begin with empty minds, meeting new lands for the first time. It began after a much older education inside the continent itself. Forests, drylands, grasslands, river valleys, coastlines, highlands, and lake basins had already taught human groups that home could take many shapes. A familiar home might be shaded and close, where sound moved through leaves and food was found by careful attention. Another home might be open and bright, where distance, heat, and animal movement mattered more. Another might be dry and severe, where water had to be remembered before thirst became dangerous. Another might lie near rivers or coasts, where life followed the movement of water, birds, fish, mud, shells, and seasons. These were not separate stories from the origin of Homo sapiens. They were part of the origin. If Africa was our first home, then diversity was one of the first things that home taught. It taught that humans could not survive by becoming perfectly suited to one narrow setting only. They had to become learners of places. This does not mean every early human group knew every African environment. No group carried the whole continent in its memory. But across long time, different populations learned different possibilities, and those possibilities widened what human life could become. Some groups learned how to survive close to water. Some learned to move through drier country. Some learned the patience of forests. Some learned the exposure of open land. Some learned the value of stone sources, animal roots, seasonal plants, or safe shelters. When groups met, moved, separated, or mixed again, knowledge could also move. It could travel through bodies, gestures, habits, and social learning. This is why the first home was not only biological. It was cultural in its earliest sense, a place where learned behavior helped human beings fit into more than one world. Recent research has suggested that before the later successful expansion beyond Africa, human populations had broadened their ecological range within Africa itself, including adaptation to challenging habitats such as forests and arid deserts. That finding fits the deeper shape of this story. The ability to leave Africa in a lasting way was not simply a sudden urge to walk outward. It likely depended on older flexibility already practiced at home. Natural History Museum also explains that migrations out of Africa did not happen all at once, but could occur in stages, with groups living in places long enough for later climate changes to open further movement. The important point for our video is not to imagine one dramatic departure. It is to imagine preparation without a visible ceremony. Long before a group crossed into another continent, their ancestors had crossed many smaller boundaries inside Africa, from wet to dry, from shade to open ground, from known water to uncertain water, from one season's habits to another season's demands. Each crossing taught a small form of leaving while still remaining within the first home. In that sense, Africa did not only hold the beginning of Homo sapiens, it trained humans for distance. It made the mind less dependent on one horizon. It made the group more important than the place alone, because a group could carry memory when the land changed. It made tools, food knowledge, care, and observation portable. A stone tool could be carried. A song or call, if such forms existed, could be remembered. A warning could be repeated. A child could learn a path from an elder and later carry that path into another landscape. The first home became something humans could partially take with them, not because they owned the land, but because they had learned from it. This is a careful idea, and it should not be pushed too far. We should not pretend to know every route, every group, or every reason for movement. The evidence is incomplete, and much of early human life left no trace. But the broad truth remains strong. Homo sapiens has deep roots in Africa, and before the species became widely established beyond Africa, human populations had already lived within a continent of extraordinary environmental variety. So the answer to, was Africa our first home, becomes richer. Yes, Africa was the first home. But it was not a small, simple home that humans merely left behind. It was a vast home of many worlds, where our species learned that survival could mean becoming familiar with difference. Before humans became a global species, they had already begun to become a flexible one. Leaving Africa was not one journey. It was not a single group waking beneath one sunrise, turning toward the horizon, and beginning the march that would fill the world. That image is powerful, but it is too clean for the truth. Human movement was slower, less certain, and more uneven. It happened across many generations, through pauses, returns, failures, small expansions, local disappearances, and later successes. When we speak of Homo sapiens moving out of Africa, we are not speaking of one straight line drawn from a first home into the rest of Earth. We are speaking of repeated movement by living people who did not know they were part of a global story. They followed water, animals, seasonal openings, coastlines, river corridors, and the changing edges of habitable land. Some groups may have moved beyond Africa and left little or no lasting ancestry in people alive today. Others may have remained near the edges of Africa and Southwest Asia for long periods. Later groups would become part of the ancestry of most people outside Africa. This is why the phrase "out of Africa" should be heard gently. It names a real and important pattern, but it can hide the complexity underneath. The first home was not left behind in one dramatic farewell. It was crossed, approached, re-entered, remembered, and slowly extended. Natural History Museum explains that one likely route for early Homo sapiens movement out of Africa passed through the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas, where land connections and changing environments could have opened paths into Eurasia. It also notes that the Arabian Peninsula, though hot and dry today, was not always the same. Ancient lakes show that greener periods could make movement possible. This matters deeply for our title because it shows that leaving the first home was connected to the same forces that shaped it: climate, water, landscape, and opportunity. Humans did not leave Africa simply because they desired distance. They moved because the world in front of them changed. A dry place could become passable after rain over long periods. A harsh region could hold lakes. A corridor could open, then close again. In this way, migration was not a heroic escape from Africa. It was another form of African learning carried outward. The same minds that had watched water, seasons, animals, and risk within Africa could read new openings beyond it. But movement did not mean certainty. A group crossing into a new region faced unfamiliar plants, animals, weather, diseases, and other human relatives. They may have survived for a while, then faded. They may have left tools without descendants. They may have mixed with other populations, moved back, or vanished from the genetic record we can still read today. This is why the story must stay humble. Archaeology gives traces, genetics gives patterns, fossils give rare bodies. But most footsteps disappeared, most camps vanished, most decisions were never preserved. A child born near a green corridor would not know that the same place might become desert long after death. An old person remembering an African water path would not know that a younger generation might one day move farther than anyone before. The human journey outward was made of these small lives, not maps. Africa remained the source, but source does not mean prison. A first home can shape a people even when they leave it. Early Homo sapiens carried African bodies, African habits of attention, African social learning, African flexibility into new lands. They carried the old need to stay close enough to others, to remember water, to follow signs, to adapt when the familiar failed. So Trucate begins with this quieter understanding. Leaving Africa was not the opposite of belonging to Africa. It was one of the results of what Africa had already taught. The first home had made humans capable of moving through change, and when the world beyond that home opened, some groups stepped into it slowly, uncertainly, without knowing whether the path ahead would continue or disappear. Some journeys out of Africa may have continued, others may have faded. This is one of the hardest truths to hold gently. Movement does not always become ancestry. A group can leave a place, survive for a while, learn a new landscape, raise children there, and still disappear from the deeper line that reaches us today. Their tools may remain. Their bones may remain, if the ground is kind. Their presence may be felt only as a small sign in stone, a fossil fragment, or a trace that later evidence changes again. But most of their living story vanishes. When we imagine early Homo sapiens moving beyond Africa, we should not imagine every path as successful. Some paths may have opened during wetter periods and closed again when deserts returned. Some groups may have reached parts of Arabia or the eastern Mediterranean only to meet climates, distances, diseases, food limits, or other human relatives that made long survival difficult. Some may have mixed with others. Some may have returned. Some may have left no descendants we can clearly identify now. This does not make those people unimportant. It makes the human story more honest. The first home of Homo sapiens was Africa, but leaving that home was not a simple victory. It was risk repeated across generations. Natural History Museum describes the spread of Homo sapiens out of Africa as a story with false starts, ghost populations, extinct human species, and paths that were not neat. Max Planck researchers have also described multiple prehistoric exits from Africa, often during wetter periods, with some populations later dying out. These points matter because they protect us from telling the story too proudly. Humanity did not spread across Earth because every movement succeeded. Humanity spread because some movements, after many uncertain attempts, lasted. A failed movement is still part of the origin story because it shows what leaving required. It required more than feet. It required enough food, enough social memory, enough reproduction, enough luck, and enough time for a population to continue. A small group could know a landscape for one generation and lose it in the next. A child born beyond Africa might never know the land their ancestors had left, but their body still carried that older African inheritance. If their group disappeared, the memory of that life disappeared with them. This is why early dispersal should feel quiet, not triumphant. It was not one heroic line moving outward with certainty. It was a fragile edge of human possibility, sometimes advancing, sometimes breaking. The later expansion that contributed much of the ancestry of present-day non-African populations is often placed around 60,000 years ago, though earlier movements happened before that. This does not mean those earlier groups were mistakes. They were human lives inside real landscapes, and they remind us that the evidence we inherit is incomplete. The fossil record is not a full memory. Genetics does not preserve every person who ever lived. Archaeology cannot hear every voice beside an ancient fire, so we must speak carefully. We can say that Homo sapiens began in Africa. We can say that there were movements out of Africa before the major later expansion. We can say that some earlier movements may not have left lasting ancestry in living people. But we should not pretend to know the feelings, names, or full stories of those who walked. What we can imagine, honestly, is the condition of leaving. The need to read unfamiliar ground, the fear of distance, the pressure of hunger, the importance of children, the weight of old knowledge in a new place. Africa remained the first home, not because no one crossed its edges, but because even those crossings began from lessons learned there. Some of those lessons survived in the groups that continued. Some vanished with groups that did not. The human story that reached the wider world was therefore not only a story of success, it was also built over silence, loss, and paths that disappeared behind the people who walked them. To leave Africa was not to stop belonging to Africa. This is one of the quietest truths in the human story. A first home does not disappear from a body simply because the body moves beyond it. The people who crossed into new lands carried more than hunger, hope, and uncertainty. They carried bodies shaped by a long African past. They carried upright walking, hands trained by tools, minds shaped by changing climates, social habits formed in small groups, and memories of water, weather, animals, danger, and care. They carried the old human need to stay near others, to watch the land, to learn quickly, and to adjust when one answer no longer worked. So when Homo sapiens moved beyond Africa, they were not leaving the first home as empty travelers. They were carrying the first home inside them, in ways they could not name. A group moving through Arabia, the Eastern Mediterranean, or later into wider Eurasia, would meet new skies, new animals, new plants, new illnesses, new cold, new distances, and sometimes other human relatives. Yet the deep habits that helped them respond had been shaped earlier. The same attention that once followed African water signs could follow unfamiliar rivers. The same patience that watched animals on African grasslands could watch different animals in a new place. The same care that kept children alive in one landscape could keep children alive in another. The same social memory that held a group together beneath an African sky could become a kind of moving shelter under unknown stars. This is why out of Africa should never sound like away from Africa in the emotional sense. It was not a rejection of the beginning. It was an extension of it. Natural History Museum explains that Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa more than 300,000 years ago, and that movement out of Africa happened in complex stages rather than as one simple journey. That means the first home remained the deepest source, even as human life spread. The line did not break at the edge of the continent, it stretched. Some groups stayed in Africa and continued their own long, rich histories there. Other groups moved outward and slowly adapted to new places. Both are part of the same human story. One did not become more human by leaving, and one did not become less human by staying. The shared origin is older than that kind of comparison. Later, as humans settled in different environments, visible differences would grow. Skin color, body shape, hair texture, and other traits would shift over long time under the pressures of sunlight, climate, diet, migration, and isolation. But those differences came after the deeper unity. They were not separate creations. They were local changes within one species whose earliest known roots remained African. This matters because people often look at difference first and origin second. The old story asks us to reverse that. Before humans looked different across the world, they had already carried a common inheritance. Before there were continents of identity, there were moving groups of Homo sapiens trying to live. Before anyone could say foreign, native, white, black, Asian, or European, there was an older human body shaped in Africa and carried into time. To leave the first home was therefore not to lose it. It was to bring its lessons into new uncertainty. A coastline became a path. A desert became a barrier or a temporary corridor. A cold land became a new teacher. A forest beyond Africa became another lesson in closeness and sound. The first home widened because the human way of carrying home had changed. Home was no longer only the place beneath the feet. It was also memory, skill, care, and adaptability traveling with the group. In that sense, Africa remained present wherever humans went, not as a flag, not as a border, but as the oldest layer of the human condition. When humans began to live in many regions beyond Africa, their bodies did not become different kinds of humans. They remained Homo sapiens. What changed slowly were some outward traits shaped by local environments, and one of the most visible was skin color. This part of the story must be told carefully, because skin has carried too much social meaning in recent human history. But in deep time, skin color was not a measure of worth, intelligence, or closeness to the human origin. It was an adaptation to sunlight. In places near the equator, where ultraviolet radiation is strong through much of the year, darker skin with more melanin offered protection. Melanin can help reduce damage from intense UV exposure, and one important idea in human evolution is that darker pigmentation helped protect folate, a nutrient important for healthy reproduction and development. In the African settings where Homo sapiens first evolved, strong sunlight was not a small detail. It was part of the living environment, like water, heat, plants, animals, and seasonal change. Skin was one more place where the body met the world. The deep African beginning of our species likely involved darkly pigmented skin because, under strong tropical sun, that kind of protection mattered. This should not be heard as a statement about modern identity, but as a statement about biology and sunlight. A body, under high UV radiation, faces different pressures from a body living for many generations under weaker sunlight. After some human groups moved into regions farther from the equator, especially places with long winters or lower UV exposure, the balance changed. Sunlight was still necessary because the human body uses UV light to help produce vitamin D. In lower UV environments, lighter skin could allow more UV to pass into the skin and support vitamin D production. Over many generations, in some northern regions, genetic variants linked with lighter pigmentation became more common. But this did not happen everywhere in the same way, and it did not happen instantly. Human skin color is not a simple ladder from dark to light. It is a broad pattern shaped by latitude, sunlight, migration, diet, culture, and time. Some populations living at similar latitudes can have different skin tones because history is complex. Some groups received vitamin D from food sources, such as fish or marine diets, which could reduce pressure in one direction. Some groups mixed with others. Some regions changed through repeated migration. The story is not a clean division between African dark skin and European white skin. It is a long human response to different sunlight regimes after a shared origin. This is why the first home remains central. The visible differences people notice today came after the older unity of Homo sapiens. Before there were people called African, European, Asian, or any other modern label, there were human bodies shaped in Africa, carrying an inheritance older than those names. Later, when groups lived in different places for many generations, the outer surface of the body began to reflect local conditions. Darker skin in high UV regions and lighter skin in lower UV regions are not separate beginnings. They are different adaptations inside one species. The mistake would be to look at skin color and imagine separate human stories. The deeper truth is the opposite. Skin color shows how one human species could adjust to different parts of Earth without becoming separate in human value. Africa was our first home not because all humans stayed physically the same after leaving it, but because all later difference unfolded from an older shared beginning. The body changed at the surface while the species remained one. Beneath every shade of skin is the same long memory of movement, sunlight, care, hunger, childhood, water, and ancestry. In that sense, the story of skin color is not a story of division. It is a quiet record of how the first African human body learned to live under many skies. Skin color is only one visible trace of human adaptation. As Homo sapiens spread into many regions, other parts of the body also met different climates, foods, altitudes, seasons, and ways of living. These changes did not create separate kinds of humans, they created local variations within one species. A body living for thousands of generations in a cold environment faces different problems from a body living in heat. In colder places, keeping warmth can matter deeply. In hotter places, releasing heat can matter more. This is one reason human body proportions vary across the world. Some populations in colder regions often show stockier builds, where the body can conserve heat more effectively. Some populations in warmer regions often show longer, leaner proportions, where heat can leave the body more easily. These patterns are not perfect rules for every person, and they should never be used to judge individuals. They are broad tendencies shaped by environment, ancestry, migration, and chance. But they remind us of the same lesson we saw with skin. The human body is not frozen. It responds slowly to the world around it. Hair, too, belongs to this story, though it is more complex than simple climate alone. Hair texture, density, and form vary widely among human populations, and many explanations remain cautious because the evidence is not always as clear as people imagine. In some environments, hair may relate to heat, sunlight, protection, or moisture. In others, it may reflect ancestry, genetic drift, or the long history of groups meeting and separating. Eyes also vary, including differences in color, eyelid shape, and other features, but these traits cannot be reduced to one simple cause. Some are shaped by selection, some by population history, some by chance, and many by a mixture of factors. The important point is not to force every difference into one neat answer. The important point is to remember that difference itself is not separation. After the first African home, humans entered many skies. Some skies were bright and intense. Some were weak with winter light. Some lands were dry. Some were humid. Some were high, thin, and cold. Some were full of seasonal hunger. Some offered fish, shellfish, roots, grains, animals, fruits, or milk in later times. Over long spans of time, the human body and culture answered these places together. Clothing, shelter, fire, diet, cooperation, and technology could reduce the pressure of climate, but they did not erase it. Biology and culture worked side by side. A group did not survive cold only because bodies changed. It survived because people learned clothing, fire, shelter, timing, and food storage in later periods. A group did not survive heat only because bodies changed. It survived because people learned shade, water, movement, rest, and seasonal rhythm. This is why the origin in Africa remains so important. Before humans looked different across the world, they already shared the deeper tools of adaptation, learning, cooperation, memory, care, and flexibility. The outward body changed in many places, but the older human inheritance traveled beneath those changes. It is also important to say clearly that these visible traits do not divide humanity into clean biological races. Human variation is gradual, overlapping, and deeply mixed through migration and interbreeding. Most human differences do not follow the sharp borders people later drew on maps or in society. A person's skin, hair, eyes, or body shape tells a small part of ancestry and environment, not the value of a life. The first home of Homo sapiens teaches the opposite of division. It reminds us that all these later differences began after a shared African origin. One group stayed in Africa and continued changing there. Others moved outward and changed elsewhere. None became more human. None became less human. They became human under different conditions. So when we look at the many faces of humanity today, we should see not separate beginnings, but many local answers to Earth. Cold, heat, sunlight, altitude, food, distance, and history touched the same species in different ways. The surface became varied, the root remained shared, After all the visible differences are named, one truth remains beneath them. All living humans belong to the same species. A person with dark skin, light skin, straight hair, curly hair, brown eyes, blue eyes, a narrow body, a broad body, a face shaped by one ancestry or another, is still Homo sapiens. These traits may tell small stories about climate, ancestry, migration, sunlight, diet, and history, but they do not create separate human beginnings. They are variations on one older theme. The first home of Homo sapiens was Africa, and from that deep beginning, human groups moved, stayed, mixed, separated, adapted, and changed. Some remained within Africa, where human diversity continued to be rich and deep. Some moved beyond Africa and slowly met new pressures in new lands. But none of these paths made one group more human than another. The surface changed. The species did not split into different kinds of worth. This is important because the eye can mislead us when it looks too quickly. The eye sees color before ancestry. It sees facial difference before shared origin. It sees the body's surface before the long time beneath it. But evolution asks us to look more slowly. It asks us to remember that human variation is gradual, overlapping, and mixed through movement over many generations. The lines that later societies drew between people are not the same as the way human biology is actually arranged. Modern genetics does not support the idea of clean biological races with sharp borders. There is often more genetic variation within self-identified racial groups than between them, and human ancestry does not obey the simple categories people later created for power, identity, or hierarchy. This does not mean ancestry is meaningless. It means ancestry is deeper and more complex than race. It means a person's body can carry stories from many directions. It means visible difference is only one thin layer over a much wider human connection. When we return to Africa as the first home, this lesson becomes quieter and stronger. Africa is not the beginning of one race. It is the beginning of Homo sapiens. It is the place where the earliest known roots of all modern human lineages reach back, long before names like African, European, Asian, or American existed. Those names may matter in culture and history, but they are recent compared with the age of our species. Before them, there were small human groups moving under African skies, learning water, food, danger, care, and memory. Before skin color became a social symbol, it was biology meeting sunlight. Before face shape became identity, it was ancestry and adaptation moving through time. Before people argued over who belonged where, the human story had already begun in a shared home older than every border. This is the educational value of the origin story. It does not erase difference. It teaches us how to understand difference without turning it into separation. Differences are real. They can be seen, inherited, lived, named, and given meaning by cultures, but they sit inside a larger unity. The same species that adapted to strong sunlight also adapted to weak winter light. The same species that learned dry lands also learned forests, coasts, mountains, and cold regions. The same species that carried children in Africa carried children across Eurasia, into islands, across ice edges, and eventually into every inhabited continent. What changed was the setting. What continued was the human condition, needing food, needing others, learning from the past, caring for the young, fearing loss, and searching for a place to rest. So if the first home of humanity teaches anything, it may be humility. No modern group can claim to be the only true human branch. No color of skin stands closer to human value. No continent after Africa begins the story alone. We are many histories, but not many species. We are many appearances, but not many separate origins. The human face became varied because the earth is varied. The human root remains shared because the beginning was shared. And beneath every difference the eye can name, there is an older memory the body still carries, that before humans were divided by later stories, they were one fragile species learning how to live. The first home of humanity does not belong to one modern group alone. It is easy from the present to look backward, and try to place ownership on the beginning. This land, this people, this color, this nation, this identity. But the beginning of Homo sapiens is older than all those claims. It reaches back to Africa more than 300,000 years ago, before modern borders, before written history, before the names people now use for continents, races, and nations. The early humans who lived there did not know they were beginning a story that would one day include the whole planet. They did not know that their bodies, tools, movements, fears, children, and memories would become part of a shared human inheritance. They were not living for an audience in the future. They were living because the next day still had to be reached, water had to be found, children had to be protected, food had to be gathered, hunted, carried, shared, or remembered. The land had to be watched. Danger had to be read. Sleep had to come near others, because being alone was too fragile. This is why Africa as our first home should not be turned into a trophy. It should be treated as a deep reminder. The origin of Homo sapiens is not a prize that one part of humanity can hold above another. It is a shared root beneath all later branches. Some branches remained in Africa and continued changing there through long histories of their own. Some branches moved into new lands and became part of the ancestry of people outside Africa. Some mixed, separated, returned, or vanished. But the deeper beginning does not become divided simply because later paths diverged. A tree may have many branches in different light, but the root is not owned by one leaf. The first home of humanity asks us to look below the surface of difference and see time. It asks us to remember that skin color, body form, language, culture, and identity all came after a more ancient unity. This does not make those differences meaningless. It makes them part of a wider story. A dark skin under strong sun, a lighter skin under weaker light, a body shaped by cold, heat, altitude, diet, movement, and ancestry. These are not separate creations of human value. They are local answers written on one species. Modern genetics also warns against treating race as a set of clear biological boundaries. Human variation is real, but it is not arranged into sharp natural boxes. There is more genetic variation within self-identified racial groups than between them, and the social categories humans use today are recent compared with the age of our species. So the first home teaches humility, not hierarchy. It says that no modern people are outside the human beginning. No modern people stand closer to Earth because of color. No modern people are latecomers to humanity because they look different from another group. Every living person carries a human body shaped by deep ancestry, and that ancestry reaches back into the same broad African origin of Homo sapiens. The first home is not a claim of superiority. It is an invitation to remember connection. It tells us that before humans learned to divide the world into territories and labels, they were small groups trying to survive under changing skies. Before anyone could inherit a passport, they inherited breath. Before anyone could belong to a nation, they belonged to a species. Before anyone argued over who was more human, all humans had already come from a story older than argument. If Africa was our first home, then the beginning of humanity was not private. It was shared before sharing had a name. Africa is not only a place in the human origin story, it is a kind of deep memory, older than any memory a person can hold. No living human remembers the first Homo sapiens who walked there more than 300,000 years ago. No voice from that time has reached us whole. No child from that world left a sentence behind. Yet the body remembers in another way. It remembers through ancestry, through shared biology, through the long inheritance of movement, care, hunger, attention, and adaptation. Africa remains inside the story of every modern human, not as a simple identity, not as a label placed on the surface, but as the oldest known ground from which our species began. This is why the first home can feel both distant and intimate. It is distant because the time is almost impossible to imagine. 300,000 years is longer than cities, longer than farming, longer than writing, longer than every nation now standing on Earth. But it is intimate because everything human still grows from that older beginning. The need to belong, the fear of being alone, the protection of children, the search for water, the use of memory, the wish to rest safely beside others. The people of that first home did not know our names, but they carried the early form of the life we still carry now. Natural History Museum describes Homo sapiens as first evolving in Africa more than 300,000 years ago, and Smithsonian also places the evolution of our species in Africa during a time of dramatic climate change. These facts are scientific, but they also carry a quiet emotional weight. They mean that the human story did not begin with separation. It began with shared vulnerability under an African sky. Before humans spread widely across the world, before they adapted to northern cold, island coasts, high mountains, forests, deserts, and long winters, the oldest root of the species was already alive in Africa. That root did not contain all later cultures, languages, and histories in a finished form. It contained something more basic, the living possibility of humanity. It contained bodies that could learn, groups that could remember, hands that could use tools, minds that could adjust, and social bonds that could keep fragile children alive. When we call Africa a deep memory of humanity, we do not mean that every person must feel it in the same way. People belong to real families, real languages, real countries, real histories, and real wounds. Those later layers matter, but beneath them is an older layer that does not cancel them. It widens them. It says that behind every modern difference is a longer continuity. Behind every face is a species story. Behind every border is a time before borders. Behind every skin color is the same human line responding to different sunlight and climate. Modern genetic science also warns us not to treat race as a set of sharp biological boxes. NHGRI explains that there is more genetic variation within self-identified racial groups than between them. That reminder is important here because the origin story should not be used to divide people more carefully. It should help people see more deeply. Africa, as first home, is not a weapon in an argument. It is a mirror turned backward into time. It shows that humanity began small, exposed, unfinished, and dependent. It shows that no one began as a nation, no one began as a race, no one began as a ruler of earth. The human beginning was quieter than pride. It was a group near water, a child held close, a path remembered, a hand learning stone, a body watching the weather, a fire guarded when fire became available, a voice, perhaps, calling others to remain near. This deep memory does not give us a complete answer to who we are, but it gives us a better question. If the oldest human home was shared before anyone knew how to divide, what should that make us remember now? So what does it mean to know that Africa was our first home? It does not mean we have solved the whole mystery of being human. It does not mean every question about our origin has a simple answer. Science continues to find new fossils, read ancient DNA, compare stone tools, study climate records, and revise older ideas when better evidence appears. That humility is part of the lesson. A truthful origin story should not pretend to know more than the evidence allows. It should stand calmly on what is widely supported. Homo sapiens has deep roots in Africa. Our species emerged there long before nations and written history, and the later differences among humans grew within one shared human family. But the value of this story is not only in the facts, it is in what those facts teach us to feel more carefully. They teach that human greatness did not begin with power. It began with vulnerability. It began with small groups that needed water, shelter, food, memory, and one another. It began with bodies that could be hurt, children who needed long care, older people whose memory could matter, and hands that slowly learned the world through stone, food, fire, and touch. It began in landscapes that changed without asking permission, under skies that could give rain or withhold it. If there is an educational message here, it is this: the human story becomes more honest when it becomes less proud. We were not born separate from nature. We were shaped inside it. We were not born above other living things. We survived among them. We were not born divided into the labels we use now. We became varied later, after long movement, adaptation, and history. The first home of humanity reminds us that difference is real, but it is not the deepest layer. Beneath difference is connection. Beneath color is ancestry. Beneath borders is time. Beneath every language is a body that still needs breath, rest, food, care, and safety. This does not erase the pain humans have caused one another. It does not erase history, injustice, migration, conflict, or identity. But it places them inside a longer view. It asks us to remember that the categories people fight over are young compared with the age of our species. It asks us to see that no person stands outside the human beginning. No child is born far from humanity because of skin, language, country, or face. Every human life is a late branch of an old root, and that root leads back, through time, toward Africa. Maybe that is why this story belongs in a quiet voice. It is not a story for shouting, it is a story for slowing down. It asks the listener to imagine a world before names, before maps, before history had pages. A group rests near water, the light is fading. Someone watches the distance. Someone holds a child, someone remembers a path, someone shares food without knowing that this small act belongs to the future of a species. There is no monument there, no flag, no written answer. Only life continuing one more night. And from such nights, repeated beyond counting, came the human world. If Africa was our first home, then perhaps the final lesson is not that we should look backward only to find where we began. Perhaps we should look backward to understand how much we still share. We are still fragile. We still need one another. We still carry old fears, old hopes, old needs, and old questions. We still build homes, leave homes, remember homes, and sometimes forget what made a home possible in the first place. So, as this story closes, the question remains open, as all deep human questions do. If all humans began from a shared first home, why do we so easily forget that we are still carrying it together?